Okay, well, thank you all for your questions. Now, as I mentioned when I uploaded the announcement video, I'm not even going to attempt to answer every question here. I'm just picking the questions that are interesting or entertaining, questions that I feel I can easily respond to without having to think too hard. So if I haven't answered your question, I'm sorry about that, but I've skipped a lot of questions. So, let's get going. Zero Bread asks, what do you think is the most ridiculous philosophical position that people take seriously? And I suppose it's going to depend on what we count as a ridiculous position. I suppose that like my intuitions here tend tend to depart from most philosophers, right? I like it when philosophy is bold and weird, and I think very often, even in terms of just what I find intuitively attractive, the sorts of positions that I'm attracted to tend to be unpopular ones. Now, I don't know. What are we counting as ridiculous? Does ridiculous mean that it's unpopular among most contemporary philosophers? Does ridiculous mean that it's the sort of position that if you were to explain it to a layperson, that they would find it absurd? Does ridiculous mean it's just not defended by any particularly good arguments? I think philosophers can be quite creative about this. You can come up with seemingly compelling arguments for almost any position. It really, like, I don't know. It depends on how one approaches this. I suppose if we just look at positions which I find sort of silly, or which I think kind of get off on, which is sort of not even wrong, as it were, positions which just seem to have some basic error in terms of how they're thinking about the topic. Well, I mean, there are, for instance, ontic accounts of explanation. So these are accounts of explanation which take explanations to be essentially like objective features of the world. That just seems to me to be a way of thinking about what an explanation is that is really bizarre, because I don't know, to me it just seems obvious that, like, well, an explanation is something that we do, it's something that we give. Like, we give explanations for things, and of course our explanations might appeal to various things that are happening in the world, but the idea that, like, an explanation in itself, like what an explanation is some objective structure in the world, has always struck me as just really bizarre. So I don't know, maybe that one. Epistemicism, about vagueness. So this is the idea that, there actually are no, like, vague. So, if we take something like, baldness, right? There really is an exact number of hairs, where you sort of go from being bald to being non-bald. Or if you take the transition from being a child to being an adult, there's like an exact point at which, an exact day, an exact moment at which you transition from being a child to being an adult. Now, of course, we don't know exactly where those points are, but there is some point. There is some exact point at which you transition. That's always just seemed kind of crazy to me. I mean, I think that probably seems crazy to most people, actually. I don't see how there could be anything sort of that would determine that one way or the other, I suppose, is the problem I have with that sort of view. I don't see how there's anything in the world or in our use of language that could fix an exact moment at which at which you go from child to adult. And the motivation for epistemicism seems very, very weak to me. I mean, it's usually about just like trying to preserve classical logic or something like that. That's another one. I suppose non-naturalist moral realism. And I think that part of the reason why I find that kind of baffling is because I just don't see, it seems like morality is something that we should care about, and I just don't know why anyone would care about the sort of pattern of non-natural properties. These are views which, it's not just that they're wrong, it's that, the very way in which they are thinking about the topic seems to kind of get off on they go off down the wrong path. I don't know. They're just wrong in deeper ways than most philosophical positions are wrong, I guess. So those are a few that I would say I find ridiculous. But again, this is coming from somebody who is attracted to positions like trivialism. So I mean, why would you care what I think is ridiculous? Okay, Agent Smith asks. Do you have any thoughts on American trailer parks? No, not really. No. Number two, out of 107 Led Zeppelin songs, how many do you like? I'm not a fan of Led Zeppelin. Do they have 107 songs? Is that actually true, or did you just pull that number out of thin air? I wonder. But anyway, I'm not really a fan of Led Zeppelin. I think that I just find them kind of cringy. I mean, half their songs are about elves and pixies, and the other half are about how much they hate women. So they sort of feel very much like the ultimate incel band to me. I mean, you can't help but think that maybe they would have had better experiences in relationships if they had decided to, date women who were over the age of 14. Maybe that would have helped them. No, I just, Led Zeppelin. I mean, look, they're very good musicians. John Bonham was a brilliant drummer, and so some of the Led Zeppelin songs that are sort of focused more on that are good, and well, they're all good musicians, right? I mean, they definitely have some good songs, like 10 or 15 good songs. Well, maybe 10 or 15 great songs, and then like 20 good songs, maybe 30 good songs. But I mean, most of what Led Zeppelin do, it just really, I don't know, I find it difficult to listen to. I mean, not exactly difficult to listen to, because I do actually enjoy listening to basically every Led Zeppelin song. And then, there's only sort of 30 or 40 Led Zeppelin songs that are actually good. I mean, the rest are kind of embarrassing. I mean, I'm not embarrassed when I'm listening to it on my own. But, there's only sort of 50 or 60 Led Zeppelin songs that I'd be willing to listen to with other people. I mean, look, Led Zeppelin is not one of my favourite bands. I mean, they've only got, I don't know, 80 or 90 like really good songs. But anyway, okay, number three, what's your favourite Harry Potter movie? Well, okay, so genuinely, right, I just did the joke about Led Zeppelin. I was never really a fan of Harry Potter, but I don't think I've seen all the Harry Potter movies. I've seen maybe, I think like 5 or 6 of them. And my favourite is The Prisoner of Azkaban. I think that was just the best in terms of the way that it was directed, the way that it built up an atmosphere. There were some kind of clever things that it did with the plot, I remember there was the thing with the time going backwards, and then it resolved. There were certain plots. It sort of resolved in this kind of interesting way, I felt. So in terms of like just the atmosphere and the narrative, I found it more appealing, at least based on, I mean, bear in mind, with some of these movies, I mean, I haven't seen them for like 20 years or something, and I didn't watch all of them, so... but if I had to pick, I'd probably pick The Prisoner of Azkaban. Okay, Alex Parks asks, can you explain what's going on with the riots in the UK, and can you give your opinion on it? I actually wasn't going to answer this question. I have a list of the questions I was gonna address. This is too big of a question I mean, how do I deal with it? Like, okay, so I can give you the simple answer, which is, I think, easy to find out, which is these riots were prompted by some news stories of somebody who the news claimed that it was a Muslim who had done a stabbing, and I think, if I recall correctly, that was misinformation. The guy actually wasn't a Muslim, but people believed it, and this sort of set off a bit of a. I mean, there has long been for a long time now. There's been a lot of anger about immigration in the UK. I mean, look, that was what ultimately was responsible for Brexit. I mean, you can make economic arguments and all this stuff, and sovereignty and all that, ultimately, I think the reason why Brexit happened is because people were angry about immigration. And since Brexit, we have done absolutely nothing to reduce immigration. In fact, immigration rates have significantly increased. I think that prior to Brexit, we were on about 200,000 per year, like net migration, and now it's something like 700,000. So, so this is the context, right? There's a lot of people angry about immigration, and there was a very serious crime which was attributed to an immigrant, and this sort of that lit the fuse that blew off the powder keg. I mean, that's the short answer. But I mean, again, to explain what's going on with these rights, I mean, the question is like, well, why was it that event? Why was it that event rather than a whole bunch of other possible events that ultimately caused people to explode? I don't know. And why is it that there was all of this anger about immigration in the first place? Again, that's a much more complex question, and a question that I don't really want to have to deal with. So I don't know why I'm even answering this. I could have just skipped it, but and I should have just skipped it. See, this has already failed. The plan has already failed. My attempt to do an AMA in a way that I liked has already failed. Why am I talking about this topic? I hate the topic of immigration. I hate it because, first of all, it just seems like there's a lot of people who are just straight up racist, and so it always ends up becoming, a kind of dog whistle for racism. And more broadly, I think that, like, I think when it comes to the whole immigration thing, like, I don't care about any of this stuff. I just don't care. I don't want to have to think about it. I don't care about it because it seems to me that, we have a sort of demographic problem, right? Which is, we have in the 1940s there was a baby boom, and then since the 1970s in the UK, fertility rates have been below replacement level. We have an aging population, and so this puts you in a position where your options are fairly limited in terms of what you can do, right? About this. I mean, basically you have, I think, 4 choices. So option number 1 is to just sort of let all of the old people die, all the dependent people. You can strip away. So what do you do when you have a sort of shrinking workforce and aging population? Well, you can just sort of stop bothering with things like benefit systems and healthcare and all of that, pensions, right? So you can strip away the safety nets and let people who are dependent die. That's not really an option though, because we're a democratic country and there's loads of old people and they all vote. So there's a limit to like how bad things can get for them before they'll kick out whoever the current government is. So option number 2 is to basically just push all the working age people to work much harder and then to jack up the taxes on them. Again, that's not particularly appealing. Option number 3 is to radically restructure the whole economic system, but I don't really know how you would do that. I mean, and even if I did have a good idea of how you would do that, I'm not sure I know how to persuade people to do that. Option number 4 is mass immigration. I mean, just bring in loads of immigrants. And so, that seems, I think it's easily understandable why we have such high rates of immigration. And I think if I was a politician, I would probably regard that as the most sensible choice, right? Like, again, you can't enact a policy that's going to, if you decide to sort of strip away pensions and all of that stuff, then that's just going to enrage the old people. So that's we're not going to win on that argument, are you? I certainly wouldn't want to live in a world where I'm having to work 60-hour weeks and give up half my income in taxes. I think that immigration, as much as it might make some people angry, it's just less, any problems that it causes are less visible. Additionally, I mean, it seems like, even if I was to believe that immigration is going to cause these massive cultural changes, I don't really care about that. Like, let's say the scaremongering is absolutely right. The people who are most concerned about immigration, you know, that they're right. You know, we're going to end up becoming an Islamic caliphate or something. Um, I don't really. I mean, that wouldn't. I don't want that to happen. Let me be clear. I mean, my values are very liberal, but I don't think it would really affect me that much. Like, I'm not really that bothered, but I think I'd be fine. Like, I would be fine. If I lived in Iran or something, I'd basically just be okay. I think my day-to-day life would pretty much be fine. I could adjust to that. Um, so, yeah, this is why I don't like to. I just don't even like having to think about this topic because the people who complain about immigration, it seems to me they don't have any plausible alternative solutions, and I'm not really worried about what they think the worst case scenario is anyway. So that's my take on that general topic. Anyway, yeah, I'm moving on now. Okay. I'm sorry. These questions I can't. I mean, what would you do if you won the lottery? I'd probably do basically what I'm doing right now. I just would never work again. But in terms of what I do in my free time, it would basically be the same. I can't believe I was talking about goddamn immigration. How? Oh God. Oh no! It already failed. It didn't work. I tried to make it work and it didn't work. Uh, okay then. So Americium asks, are there any known philosophical positions, arguments to literally anything in philosophy that we can definitely say, yes, this is a correct and true philosophical fact, much like we do in the sciences and maths? If not, then why can't philosophy come to a definitive truth of things? I tend to think that there are basically no knockdown arguments in philosophy. I mean, for any philosophical position that's taken seriously, you can find plenty of philosophers who reject it. You know, for any argument, you can find plenty of philosophers who are poking holes in it. For any sort of approach to philosophical methodology, you can find plenty of philosophers who say, like, no, that kind of method, that way of trying to solve problems is just fundamentally misconceived. And I think there's a few different reasons for this. So, first of all, I think it's just like part of what is involved in philosophy is a kind of questioning of almost anything, at least in principle. Now, I mean, in practice, of course, philosophers will, you know, they will be short-sighted and they will make assumptions, and you know, they will engage in kind of bandwagoning, and there are philosophical fashions, and then there are going to be views which philosophers hold without questioning or without sort of seriously questioning. Philosophers are only human, right? But I think that in terms of the sort of ideal of philosophy, right, the ideal is you know, like we subject, you know, everything, right, all of our views and beliefs to sort of serious critical challenge. And so, and I mean, I think that like what philosophy involves is a kind of stepping back from any given inquiry or from any given activity and asking, like, well, what assumptions is this activity making? Are those assumptions justified? So, you know, we do this with science, right? Like in philosophy of science, we'll kind of step back and we'll sort of say, okay, what exactly is the scientific method? Is it justified? Like, you know, we have Hume's problem of induction, which, you know, maybe raises some skeptical challenges to one of the underlying principles of the scientific method, right? Maybe it does that. But yeah, I mean, so like whenever we have any beliefs, whenever we engage in any sort of inquiry, I think part of the function of philosophy is kind of just stepping back from those beliefs and from that type of inquiry and asking, what's the justification? And, you know, it's always going to be possible to find perspectives from which you can reasonably criticize those beliefs or that type of inquiry. But that's then, you know, reflexive. Like philosophers can do that to philosophy itself. So for any philosophical tradition, you can then step back from that tradition and start to challenge its underlying assumptions. I mean, philosophy is it's a sort of catch-all, isn't it, for any kind of inquiry that doesn't kind of fall neatly into the other academic categories. There's a whole bunch of different philosophical traditions, and then for any one of those traditions, you're going to be able to sort of step back from it and attack it and challenge it. So there's really nothing. It doesn't matter how popular a particular philosophical view becomes. It doesn't matter how compelling you think a particular argument is. There's nothing in principle that's going to prevent a new philosophical tradition emerging that questions the foundations of that approach to philosophy. So we're gonna, any belief, any argument, any methodology, we're always going to be able to kind of step back and critically attack it. So I think that this is why we don't have knockdown arguments. I mean that's a point about the sort of just the nature, as it were, of philosophy itself. But I mean, there's also some institutional pressure, I think, towards actually being critical and actually finding these alternative perspectives, and that's because saying novel things gets you attention. So within the institutions of philosophy, the way that it works these days is, if there is a certain belief or argument or methodology that is widely accepted by a lot of philosophers, if you are able to step back from it and critically attack the assumptions that underlie it, well, now you've got a novel position. You've got an interesting position. All of the people who are part of the status quo are going to want to respond to you. So you're going to get attention from them because they're going to want to show that actually your argument doesn't work. And so I mean, you end up getting attention even if ultimately few people end up agreeing with you. So what it ends up looking like is there are just no knockdown arguments. You never get into a place where we just all agree like this is how we do things, or at least it never lasts. It doesn't last very long. So yeah, I think that's my answer to that one. aWanderingKnight asks, if I believe there are no moral facts and I would be strict and honest about this, how could I justifiably, with a reason I'm conscious of, decide to do anything? Or how could I evaluate and reasonably decide taking any action over another one? I find it difficult to get myself into the mindset of a person who would find this to be a compelling problem, because to me this is just I mean I just don't get it. Like let's forget about metaethics, right? First of all, okay, so we're framing this in terms of whether or not they're moral facts, but even if I was to accept moral realism, it would still be the case that actually the vast majority of my actions are not informed by my beliefs about morality. I just, and I think that's probably true for most people actually, that most people most of the time just aren't really thinking about morality when they act. I mean, let's say I wake up in the morning and I'm trying to think about, well, what should I do today? Okay, maybe I will think to myself, oh, I should donate something to charity, or I should go and give blood, right? I should do something good for the world. But most of it's going to be like, okay, well, what should I have for breakfast? Or should I go out for a walk? I mean, what's the weather doing? And these are not moral questions, right? I mean, you have certain desires, goals. You have things that bring you pleasure, things that bring you pain, right? You have things that interest you, things that bore you, and I think most of what you do is going to be based on that. You have your own sort of well-being that you care about, and then presumably the well-being of at least some other people. I mean, and you have attachments to other people, so you care about their well-being. You want to have consistent beliefs. You want your actions to conform to those beliefs. I think most of the time, in terms of the way that you act, moral considerations are not going to be part of the deliberation. Now, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's not true for you, right? I can certainly imagine a person whose life really is like almost entirely structured around their sense of moral duty. But I think that would be a very unusual sort of person. That's certainly not the case for me. So, I mean, my initial reaction to the question you're asking is just like, well, you know, I'm just not even thinking about morality most of the time. And now, even if I was thinking about morality most of the time, let's say I was the kind of person who was thinking about morality most of the time, well, I don't really see why it makes any difference whether we frame morality as something that is, you know, discovered versus something that we invent, right? I mean, if I'm a moral anti-realist, if I think there are no moral facts, I can, you know, I still have values, right? I still have things that I care about. I may well want to have beliefs and actions that are consistent with my fundamental values. So I suppose I just don't really see the problem here, to be honest. Nothing stops a moral anti-realist from continuing to use moral discourse and to, you know, assess certain actions as being good or bad. So as long as you can do that, what's the problem? What difference does it make if we say that actually it's an objective fact what's good or bad? I don't see that it makes a difference. Bob Jacobs asks, what question would you wish someone would ask you? Something about the old run of Doctor Who, so from 1963 to 1989. That's the only topic that I actually really care about. I mean, philosophy I can, you know, take it or leave it at this point, but the old series of Doctor Who, that has a special place in my heart, and I could talk about that for hours and hours. And I actually have done that on this channel before, but I guess, yeah. So something about that. C asks, if I recall correctly, one of your views is epistemological permissivism. How would you argue for that view? So I take it that what you have in mind here is my view that it's perfectly fine, it's not irrational to hold beliefs without justification. There's nothing irrational about holding beliefs that are not supported by the evidence. So, I mean, I suppose there's a couple of different reasons why I'm attracted to this kind of position. First of all, I find radical skeptical arguments, very compelling. So, as far as I'm concerned, even believing things like I have hands, or, you know, he is a hand, I think that this requires, you know, a leap of faith, as it were, beyond the evidence. In fact, I just don't see any justification for that whatsoever. I just don't think there's any reason at all to believe that, you know, that I have hands. There's nothing, as far as I can see, that actually favours the common sense hypothesis over a variety of alternative hypotheses on which it would not be the case that I have hands. So even to hold a belief such as I have hands is, as I said, you know, that's without justification. Now the question is, what would be wrong with that? Like, what's the problem with holding that belief anyway, right? Like, let's say I just say, right, I'm just gonna believe it. I'm just gonna, you know, take this leap of faith and just believe it. What's the problem with doing that? I don't see any problem with doing that. I mean, yeah, you're holding a belief without justification, but so what? I mean, why is that a problem? Indeed, insofar as I find radical skeptical arguments compelling, notice that any account of why there would be a problem with doing that is itself also going to be subject to these radical skeptical arguments. Yeah, I mean, part of it is just, I think that there is no alternative in a way. I mean, if you want to hold beliefs about the world, I think there's just no alternative to doing it without justification. If we insist on beliefs having justification, then what we end up with is a situation where we just don't hold any beliefs. And I can't again. Given that in order to have beliefs at all, there's no alternative to doing it without justification, and given that I don't see anything problematic about taking a leap of faith in some of these cases, yeah, I mean that's basically the reason why I'm inclined to endorse permissivism, voluntarism about this stuff. I suppose that's the basic reason. I mean, it's a view that it pretty much just comes from Hume, right? I mean, as I suppose is the case for many of my official philosophical positions, ultimately the source for this is in Hume. Hume's view on skeptical arguments was, well, that there is no good, rationally compelling response to them. There is nothing we can do to overturn these arguments as long as we're sort of sticking to reason and evidence, right? Ultimately, if you're going to hold beliefs about the world, the way that happens is that you just stop thinking about the skeptical arguments. You get up, you go outside, you start playing billiards with your friends, and then the sort of custom, the habit of the mind is such that certain beliefs are just kind of forced upon you. I don't know. I mean, I don't actually agree that with the sort of psychological irresistibility thesis anymore. I don't think that beliefs are really forced upon us, but I think we can make a choice. We can choose to believe certain things. We can sort of choose to commit ourselves to certain worldviews. In making those commitments, there can't be any epistemic justification for that. But again, I just don't see the problem with it. So I suppose I mean, I don't know if this is a particularly good positive argument, but what I would say is I don't see the problem with holding beliefs without justification. So I guess I would just leave it up to the opponent to explain what they think the problem with that is. Okay, do you think arguments for antinatalism or pessimism can also imply promortalism? It's not a very popular view, and it's understandable why, but it seems few pessimists have taken it seriously, either as an objection or a conclusion they're willing to accept. Well, I suppose, this is just going to depend on the argument for antinatalism, right? I mean, I can certainly imagine arguments for antinatalism, which are going to imply promortalism. If you are, for instance, a negative utilitarian, so you think that what we ought to do is minimize suffering, and that's it, and you don't put any weight at all on maximizing pleasure, then, yeah, I mean, that's going to very straightforwardly lead to promortalism. Then it would mean that what you ought to do is just end existence, period. Not only should you not bring people into existence, but actually what you ought to do is, even the people who currently exist, you ought to end their existence. And I suppose even traditional utilitarianism would imply that if we assume that the amount of suffering in the world sufficiently outweighs the amount of pleasure, or the amount of suffering in a life sufficiently outweighs the amount of pleasure in that life, then the utilitarian, even a traditional utilitarian, would say you ought to end that life. So yes, there are some arguments for antinatalism or pessimism that imply promortalism. I think that the most convincing arguments don't imply that. So, I mean, if one looks at arguments like, Benatar's asymmetry thesis, or if one takes the argument that sort of, the reason why we ought not to bring somebody into existence is, if I say, well, the reason why we ought not to bring somebody into existence is because, life is generally bad, suffering generally outweighs pleasure. That in itself, I don't think implies promortalism, because it seems to me that there is a relevant difference between, starting a life and ending a life that currently, like ending the life of a person who currently exists. The sorts of conditions that are, the sorts of standards, the standard to which we hold starting a life is plausibly different from the standard that we would apply when it comes to the question of whether to end a life. I think the fact that most people who are alive want to continue living, the fact that they actually have the desire to continue living, is very important to me. That seems very relevant. Like I want I don't want to die, right? That's one of the reasons why it makes it bad to kill me. On the other hand, when it comes to the question of whether to bring somebody into existence, it's not like there is some entity that exists in the void that is just wishing that it could be brought out of the void. No, so if I choose not to bring somebody into existence, I'm not I'm not going against their wishes. They don't have any wishes, right? That seems like a really important difference to me. So yeah, I think that there are some arguments for antinatalism that will imply promortalism, but I think the best arguments for antinatalism don't imply that. And I do think that promortalism is a position which I would want to resist. It's a pretty heavy cost, I would say, if your moral theory ends up implying that. So yeah. Okay, is there a classic contemporary philosophy book or trend that you don't understand the hype about? Well, of course, there are, philosophers that I pretty strongly disagree with. I think Wittgenstein is very overrated. But actually, I think that one person that I find it puzzling, the sort of influence that he had might have been Quine, right? And in particular, Quine's insistence on extensionalism. So Quine's insistence on this criterion of extensionality for any acceptable theory, right? This is what led him to reject propositional attitudes. This is what led him to reject modality, right? This is like a lot of Quine's views are grounded in his extensionalism, and I'm sympathetic to some of the conclusions that Quine reaches. So I can be like, when it comes to eliminative materialism or modal skepticism, these are views that I'm sympathetic to, but Quine's path to those views, it struck me, it just seems really odd to me. I think that the extensionalism, I think, is just very poorly motivated. And in particular, it's poorly motivated for Quine because his arguments that he makes in other contexts seem to me to pose just as much of a problem for extensions as they do for intensions. If you look at Quine's arguments for the indeterminacy of meaning, that raises just as much a problem for the notion of extension as it does for intentions. At least as far as I can see. So yeah, I just find, the extensionalism, I don't think there was ever a compelling motivation for it. And so it's odd that ended up being quite so influential. I'm not even sure if it was influential, really, if that part of it was influential. But yeah, Quine maybe is a sort of odd figure in some ways. So I don't know. Maybe that doesn't quite answer the question, but yeah, that's what I'm going to go with. Okay, channel name goes here. On your daily escapades, you run into a genie. The genie tells you that if you haven't achieved world domination by the time you die, the Earth will explode. You are certain he is telling you the truth. How do you utilize your knowledge and skills as a philosopher to take over the world? I don't care. First of all, I don't think I would be successful. I think this is totally futile. Nobody's going to take over the world. It's just not happening. There's no single person that's going to take over the world. At least not right now. I don't know, maybe with developments in AI or whatever, it would become possible. Who knows? But I doubt it. Certainly, given the world as it is right now, no one's taking it over. if anybody could take it over, it would not be a philosopher. Philosophers are not in a position to take over anything, to be honest. I mean, I know that maybe philosophers like to think that, look, our talent is in giving compelling arguments and, we're able to reason. But actually, when it comes to taking over the world, what you need is not like a good argument. What you need is just rhetoric. And that's just not something that contemporary philosophers really care about. So the skills that I have as a philosopher are not particularly well suited to taking over the world. And even if they were, I'm just not interested in doing that. Now, I mean, the way that you've set this up is, well, if you don't take over the world is going to explode, everyone's going to die. The thing is, this happens after I'm dead. So, look, I'm basically self-interested. I mean, I do care about other people to some extent, right? I'm not a total psychopath. But I think, like every other human being, right, I'm basically selfish. I'm not going to sacrifice my life to a project that I just have no interest in whatsoever in order to save the world. I'm just not going to do it. I don't know, maybe some people would do that, but I think a lot of people wouldn't, right? Like, ultimately, you care about yourself and you care about maybe your loved ones. Maybe if I had children, this would be different, right? Because if I had kids, I might care about maintaining a habitable environment for them going forward, but I don't have that. So there's a very small number of people that I really care about, and they're all they're either older than me or around about the same age as me. So it's not going to be really that tragic if they die when I die. Like assuming I make it to sort of 80 or 85, which hopefully I will. So yeah, look, I mean, the other thing is just I'm not really that impressed by the world, by existence. I mean, I'm a pessimist. I think life is basically bad. So I don't want people to die. I think it would be terrible if they died. But I mean, ending humanity, ending this the project of life. It would be bad insofar as it's a bad thing that when a person who wants to continue existing dies, but it would have a sort of nice consequence, which is, well, we wouldn't be bringing anybody else into this, So I really don't feel much motivation to care about the genie's threat. So there you go. Okay then. So Cyclone de Monkey asks, have you ever gone over your reasons on your vasectomy after you had it done? As in, have you updated or refined the reasons into something more sophisticated and more integrated into the rest of the thoughts of your own existence? Well, actually, yes, and I uploaded a video about this. I did upload a video in which I made some reflections on my vasectomy. I can't remember exactly what that was called. Let me get the exact title of that one. But I guess, if you just type in KMB vasectomy, it should probably come up. It's called Reflections on Sterilization. I uploaded that about 7 months ago. So, yes, I actually have reflected on this a bit further. And, this is something which, honestly, I think about this pretty much every day. I regard it as one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. And so I'm often kind of rethinking that and considering the sort of, just the how good I feel about it. It's just something that makes me feel very good about myself. It's something which it's not exactly an achievement, is it? Because it's not something I did to myself. It was something I had, the doctor is the one who was responsible. The surgeon is the one who did it. So I don't know if I'd exactly call it an achievement, but it's something that I'm very pleased that I did. And so it's just nice to kind of, think about that. Having said that, I'm not really the type of person who, kind of has any sort of integrated story of my own life. So Galen Strawson draws a distinction between two different personality types. There are some people who have a kind of narrative approach to their lives, and if you have a narrative approach, then you're going to essentially organize your life into a story. There's a narrative, right? There's sort of some overarching goal or purpose, and then there's this narrative of hopefully, if things go well, achieving the goal. And you try to sort of fit your experiences at any given moment into this overarching narrative, and you try to think about how those experiences relate to what you consider the sort of goal or purpose to be. And then, so that's, narrative. On the other extreme, we have what he calls episodics. And episodics are people who don't really think about the future in much detail. They don't have any long-term plans, and they don't reflect much on the past. They don't, they're not sort of nostalgic. They don't tell a story about their lives. They just kind of exist in the moment. I can say that I have always been very much on the episodic side. I'm a pretty extreme episodic. I tend to live in something of a void, really. Anything like once something's the past, I don't think about it at all. I mean, even with my vasectomy, it's not like I tell a story about it, right? I mean, my vasectomy is relevant to me because it is a feature of my body right now. It's like, that's what my body is like right now. And of course, I recognize that I'm more comfortable in my current body than I was before I had the vasectomy. I mean, certainly, the fact that I am sterile, the fact that this is now a property of my body, is something that I really like. And so I can kind of, if I sort of think about the past, I can recognize that there was an improvement. But to me, this isn't part of some grand story. It was just there was something I didn't like about myself, and so I changed it, and I'm happy about that. So when it comes to this idea of sort of, integrating this into thoughts of my own existence, I don't think that's really the way that I approach life at all. I don't think about the long-term future, and I very rarely will think about my past. I just kind of deal with. I think about a week ahead. That's to me, time lasts for about a week, and anything outside of that is I don't know. It's of very little importance to me. So I suppose, with that said, then I guess the answer is yes. I have. I do think about my vasectomy, but whether I, have I refined my reasons into some sophisticated narrative that's integrated with the thoughts of my existence? Well, no. But that's just not the kind of person I am. Okay. Edgar Qer says, question about relativism. Do I understand correctly that your moral anti-realist and non-cognitive position is also a position that is true depending on the perspective, and there are perspectives within which moral realism and moral cognitivism are true? Or is moral realism false in all perspectives? Well, first of all, I should clarify that I don't really consider myself a non-cognitivist anymore. I think that, I think my position on, the meaning of moral statements is there's just no fact of the matter. I endorse a kind of indeterminacy view of meaning just across the board. There are certainly contexts where it's useful to interpret moral statements along cognitivist lines. I think, there are contexts where it's useful to interpret moral statements along non-cognitive lines. I don't think there is any sort of universal theory that is applicable to all moral statements. And sometimes even when you take, a single instance of a moral statement, it may be that there's just no fact of the matter what the correct interpretation of it is. I think that's something that's quite, there's a mistake that I think a lot of philosophers make, which is the mistake of thinking that that there's, some sort of precise meaning, there's the semantics, the precise meaning, the proposition that is expressed by a statement, where this is, you have the statement that somebody says. So I might come along and say something like, oh, abortion is terrible, abortion is wrong, right? Somebody might say abortion is wrong. And then there's this idea that, they must be expressing some proposition. There's some meaning. Or maybe it's not that they're expressing a proposition. Maybe they're expressing some non-cognitive state. But either way, there is some fixed, precise thing that is being expressed. And that's just an approach to meaning that I get on board with. Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself a non-cognitivist anymore. But to turn to the question that you're really asking, I mean, so with relativism, relativism in itself obviously doesn't take any particular stand on this. One can be a relativist and think that moral realism is indeed false in all perspectives, or at least all plausible perspectives, or something like that. You could hold that view. I think that would be it's a possible view, right? It's not my view. I'm a pretty radical relativist. I'm extremely permissive. I would say, yeah, I mean, there are perspectives from which moral realism is true. I mean, okay, here's a simple example, right? Here's a perspective which is going to get you the truth of anything, the trivialist perspective. Trivialism is the view that all propositions are true. And I think that trivialism, there are multiple ways of being a trivialist and of it being a sort of plausible approach to meaning and indeed to the world. I find trivialism, I'm sympathetic to it. So there you go. There's a perspective from which you just straightforwardly get the truth of moral realism. You get the truth of everything. Yeah, I mean. So yeah, that's the answer to that, right? Okay. So you ask, Goodman believed that there was no version of an independent world. Is this true for the version that the world is just one entity? In other words, a version of the world that is not divided into parts in any way. So yes, I mean, I take it that the point here is that according to Goodman, he wants to say that there are many worlds, and his argument for this is there are many true versions, and to every true version there corresponds a world. And on Goodman's interpretation, a world is something that makes a version true. You can think of a world as being like a set of objects or something that makes a particular version true. A world is not just identical to a version. So I guess this is where this question is coming from. That there's if we there is no independent world. There's no version independent world. And in particular, if we think that there's a version in which the world is just one thing, then I suppose the challenge is going to be, well, it looks like if you're supposing that there's just one thing, then you can't even draw a distinction between the version and the world. But then what's going on there? Because you have a version where the world is just one thing. And so, if that's a true version, then that's going to be made true by there being just one thing. But if you have a version and it's being made true by a world, then you've got two things. You have a version and a world. I'm not entirely sure if that's what you were getting at, but I see a problem there, a problem for Goodman. Or at least I would see a problem for Goodman if it were not for the fact that Goodman has extremely high standards for what counts as a true version. Goodman is not, he's not like me, right? He's not very permissive about, in his relativism. As far as Goodman is concerned, not just any version is a true version. It's extremely difficult to make a true version. A true version needs to have explanatory power. It needs to be consistent with the empirical data. It needs to be fruitful. It needs to be something that we can apply in lots of different contexts. It needs to make useful predictions. It needs to be logically consistent, etc., etc., right? So there's all these sort of the standard theoretical virtues that philosophers like to talk about. As far as Goodman is concerned, versions need to exhibit those theoretical virtues in order to count as true versions. And I think that the Parmenidean world in which there's just one thing, and there's no distinctions, that I can't imagine that Goodman would regard that as a true version. I mean, I think he would just say, well, it sort of conflicts with very just obvious data. Like, just look around. You can find distinctions. I mean, just open your eyes, right? In the very act of opening your eyes, you will see the distinction between closed eye and open eye. This is something which it doesn't make any predictions. It's not particularly fruitful. It's not clear where we can take inquiry if we adopt this Parmenidean view. It may not even be logically coherent. So yeah, I mean, this is going to be the problem. So I think that the issue that you seem to be raising there, at least as far as Goodman is concerned, it wouldn't be a problem for him, because he would just deny that that the sort of Parmenidean one, he would deny that that's a true version. Okay, what disappointed you about political libertarianism? Well, this is going back a few years now. I used to be a libertarian. I mean, I suppose in some ways I still am a libertarian. Like, I still have libertarian sympathies, but only libertarian sympathies. And when I say the word libertarian, I mean it in a fairly broad sense. I'm certainly more on the sort of left libertarian side these days. I used to be a kind of right libertarian. I used to be a Nozikian libertarian. I was attracted to anarcho-capitalism for a while. But this is like back when I was a teenager. So, I mean, over a decade ago now. Okay, so why did I change my mind about it? Well, I suppose there's a few reasons. First of all, I just became more selfish. I mean, this might sound a little bit weird because I think that libertarianism is often accused of selfishness. Like, libertarians, it's often viewed as a vice of libertarians, that they're selfish, right? Selfishness is viewed as like a feature of the libertarian personality. The sort of person who's attracted to libertarianism is going to be somebody who's very selfish. And I suppose it makes sense because you sort of think of libertarianism, and when I say libertarianism here, I mean the kind of Nozikian libertarianism, the right libertarianism, the US style libertarianism. I mean, this stereotype makes sense because, of course, it's sort of associated with capitalism, free market capitalism, competition, cutthroat competition, stripping away benefits, letting the poor people starve, right? This is what the view is associated with. But the thing is that for me, when I was a libertarian, I was motivated by, I really felt the force of this basic idea that, like, no, people have sort of rights over certain, things, right? People have property rights, and it's just wrong to, like, steal stuff, right? We just shouldn't do that, and it doesn't make any difference who's doing the stealing. If somebody kind of comes up to you in the street with a gun and demands that you hand over money, I didn't see that as being fundamentally different from, the government coming along and demanding that you hand over money. I just thought that, I was just like, this is just wrong. And I was never rich, right? It's not, I mean, I've never been a particularly rich person, but it didn't matter to me when I was younger. I just reacted to this very negatively. So my commitment to libertarianism, it certainly wasn't out of self-interest, at least not in any obvious way. But as I got older, I just started to realize, I just don't really care about, the wealthy. I actually don't care about them. I don't care if the government, you know what, if in order for me to have access to free healthcare, that requires us, putting a gun to wealthy people's heads and demanding that they hand over money, I'm actually okay with that. And that reaction comes out of an increasing selfishness, right? Like, I got more selfish, and so that was one of the things that started pushing me to the left. It was like, hang on, I'm not rich, right? I might well depend on some of these sorts of safety nets and benefit systems. In fact, I have in my life. I've used the NHS. And look, I mean, maybe there are better ways to run things. Maybe the free market would be better, right? But the thing is it didn't, at least at the time, it didn't seem plausible to me that it would be better in just every respect. So yeah, I mean, this is one reason, right? I just kind of stopped caring about, the idea of, like, okay, well, this person owns this person has a right over this, fairness, all of that, moral principles. I just became more selfish. I think that as well, I mean, there are more perhaps serious issues with libertarianism. I don't think it's so well suited to solve certain problems to do with negative externalities. I mean, climate change, pollution, that sort of stuff. There are things that you can do within a libertarian framework, but I think that these sorts of cases probably do need like top-down government intervention. And additionally, I mean, I had a real shock when I was sort of in my later teens, when I realized that I was allowing my beliefs about the empirical facts to be guided by my ideological commitments, because I was a climate skeptic for a while, and I just had this moment, where it just struck me that I was like, the only reason why I'm a climate skeptic, the only reason why I'm, sort of denying the current consensus that climate change is a problem that we need to deal with, the only reason why is because I'm a libertarian, and because I don't want to acknowledge that, yeah, actually there might be an important role here for government intervention. And so I was kind of just jumping through any hoop I could find to resist that. And it really troubled me that I was doing that and that I was thinking in that way. So that put me off. And then, when I realized that that was what I was doing, I would then look at other people within the libertarian community, and I was like, kind of seems like they're probably doing the same thing. Yeah, that was another sort of shock that moved me. And I suppose as well, I just became a little bit more, I had a bit more epistemic humility about things like, I don't know, the fact that I don't have any knowledge of economics. So I suppose that I can't exactly, this isn't a point from which I can criticize libertarianism, of course, but it seems odd to be very strongly committed to a particular political position, which includes, pretty controversial economic positions, if you don't really know anything about economics. Yeah, I suppose all of that pushed me away from libertarianism. Okay, so Elia Perli asks, all or almost all mathematics is done with first order logic and set theory. Why should we bother with higher order logics? Well, first of all, just for their own sake, because we're interested in exploring what properties they have as formal systems. That seems like enough of a justification for me. I don't think anything more is required than that. People are just interested in exploring different formal systems, and that's that. And now, if more of a justification is required, then I think the answer from the point of view of philosophy would be that, the reason why philosophers are so interested in logic is that, we can take different formal logics as essentially being kind of theories or models of the consequence relation of what follows from what. Most of the time, the context in which we, there's various different applications that we can have for any given formal system, right? And in philosophy, right, one of the most important applications is it's a theory of correct reasoning, right? Philosophers want to work out what follows from what. They want to work out, patterns of truth preservation. They want to work out what correct reasoning is. So take, say, classical logic and paraconsistent logic, right? These are two rival logics. In classical logic, we have the principle of explosion. So from a contradiction, anything follows, right? If you assert a contradiction, then you can derive anything from it in classical logic. Then you have paraconsistent logic, where that's not true, where you can assert a contradiction and it's not going to be the case that just anything follows. So paraconsistent logics can handle contradictions. Now, you can just take these as being formal systems, and you might just be interested in exploring their properties for that reason. Or maybe you have some other application. Maybe paraconsistent logics might have some useful application in the context of computer science, I don't know, dealing with inconsistent sets of information or something like that. But in philosophy, what we're interested in when philosophers sort of talk about classical logic versus paraconsistent logic, the conflict here is supposed to be that, well, these provide us with two different theories of what correct reasoning looks like. So if it's the case that there really are true contradictions, and some philosophers have argued that there really are true contradictions, well, then surely the correct account of the consequence relation, the correct account of what follows from what, is not going to be classical logic. Unless you want to end up being committed to trivialism, which most philosophers don't want that. No, I mean, if you think that there are true contradictions, then you're going to say that the correct account of the consequence relation has to be paraconsistent. So, so the way most philosophers see it, there's a genuine question here. Is it the case that anything follows from a contradiction? Well, if there are true contradictions, then no, that's presumably not the case. And so that would be, that we then say, okay, we favour paraconsistent logic. Now, the point of all of this is, why would we be interested in bothering with higher order logics? Well, it's because, it might well be that, when it comes to sort of reasoning and argument, we need higher order logics in order to capture some of the sort of structure that we find in arguments, and they might then tell us something important about the consequence relation. So I suppose that would be the defense from a philosophical point of view of exploring these systems. Okay, so HarmonicaLuke asks, what is virtuous circular reasoning as opposed to vicious? Well, I suppose that one context where circular reasoning it sort of has more of a virtuous character is in contexts where we can show that a particular theory is self-supporting, where it might be like an open, initially, like it's an open question whether or not the theory would be self-supporting. So, we might have a theory where we're sort of not sure whether it's self-undermining or self-supporting. And if we can then show that it's self-supporting, then that might be a kind of circular argument, but that would presumably be a good result. So take, for instance, naturalistic epistemology. So basic idea here is we're going to use our best scientific theories to, explain the reliability of sense perception or something like that. We're going to use, when we sort of ask whether or not our faculties are reliable, or we ask which faculties are reliable, the way that we answer that question is by applying our best scientific theories. So we can take our best scientific theories of how the human visual system works, for instance, and show that under certain conditions it produces reliable results. Now, there's a worry about this way of proceeding, which is, well, the scientific theories are themselves based on sense perception, right? So in a sense, this is going to be circular. The scientific theories are being used to establish the reliability of sense perception, but then those scientific theories are themselves based on, what we observe. So there's a circularity there, but importantly, there's no a priori guarantee that that this way of approaching epistemology is going to be self-supporting. In principle, it could be the case that our scientific models end up entailing that our capacities are just totally unreliable. So it could be the case that our best models of sense perception end up entailing that sense perception is totally unreliable. For instance, we've arguably shown that colour perception is extremely misleading in certain significant respects. Arguably. Obviously, this is a big debate, right? But, people who are on the more anti-realist side about colours would say that, there's, when I sort of classify certain objects as blue, I'm just being sort of deeply misled about the actual properties of those objects. Actually, maybe a better example of this would be something like Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. If Plantinga's right, then if we adopt a kind of naturalistic epistemology and we think that human beings are products of evolution and all of that stuff, then we end up having to say that we just have, we have no grounds for trusting any of our faculties, because those faculties are products of a process that is not truth tracking. We have whatever faculties we do, as a result of whatever promoted survival and reproduction, and there's just no guarantee that survival and that process would produce faculties that reliably deliver true beliefs as opposed to faculties that reliably deliver useful but false beliefs, right? So yeah, I mean, if that argument is successful, then it would turn out that the naturalist framework is just self-undermining. So I think that this is a context where a kind of circular argument can be useful, because what we can do is to show that, we can say, look, so we take our best scientific theories, we use those scientific theories to explain how it is that certain faculties are reliable. Now we're depending on those faculties in order to establish the scientific theories in the first place. But because there was no guarantee that it would turn out to be self-supporting in that sort of way, we at least can say, look, we have an epistemology that's justified by its own lights, and that is something to be quite pleased with. Now, this, of course, is not going to answer a skeptic. If somebody's a skeptic and just doesn't accept naturalist epistemology, this is not going to convince them. But it doesn't have to be framed as an answer to the skeptic, right? It can be framed as, right, we have a theory that is self-supporting rather than self-undermining, and that's a good result. So I suppose it's just a matter of how you, in the case of certain circular arguments, maybe it's a matter of how you present the argument. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe the thing that I've just outlined there isn't really a circular argument, but that's just one idea, right? That's a suggestion. Okay, Homo economicus. Do you believe that private ownership of land and natural resources, i.e. resources that are not man-made, is justified? And if not, do you believe it's justifiable? Are you convinced by the defence of private ownership offered by John Locke, Robert Nozick, or any other philosopher? Well, my line on this is broadly, I suppose, utilitarian. My inclinations here. I think that, when I think about what system of property conventions should we adopt, my answer is, well, just whatever system of property conventions would tend to promote well-being for the greatest number of people, and that's about it. So the way the way I approach this is to think, well, imagine a world in which we just don't have any property conventions at all. I suppose this is the sort of classic state of nature, as it were. It does seem that if nobody recognised any kind of ownership relation, then that seems like that probably would lead to violence and conflict and so on. I mean, certainly if we were living in a world where everybody just sort of took whatever they wanted, that would probably be an unpleasant world. I wouldn't want to live in a world like that. I like to have the sort of sense that there's a certain space, like a house, that I can occupy, that nobody else is supposed to come into. I like the idea that there are certain objects that I can reliably access over and over again because they're mine, right? So I mean, okay, so if I was living in a world where everybody was just taking whatever they wanted, I think I would try to urge people to adopt some sort of property convention. And maybe we could start with a convention like, everybody owns whatever is currently in their possession, right? And then we just sort of build out from there, and you build up more complex rules from there. But yeah, ultimately, the sort of rules that I would want to lay down, the property conventions that I would want to lay down, would just be whatever it is that makes most people happiest. So I approach it in a pretty utilitarian way. I mean, as I see it, ownership relations are entirely a matter of convention. I don't at all buy the notion that there is some objective, society-independent fact of the matter about who owns what. And frankly, even if there were, right, let's say that it's just somehow an objective fact that, I own this computer. There's some sort of ownership relation that binds me to this computer. Who cares? Why would we care about that? I want to structure society in whatever way is going to, promote well-being for most people. I don't want to structure it in whatever way happens to conform to these mind-independent ownership relations. So, like, even if I was to get on board with the sort of theories advanced by people like John Locke and Robert Nozick, I would still just say, you know what, I don't care about that. You can have your objective ownership relations. I do not care about that. I want to live in a world where the sort of legal norms are such that we're just, we act as if the ownership relations were whatever way they would have to be in order to, basically just promote well-being for the greatest number. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of specifics of those kinds of, Lockean and Nozickian theories, I think that when it comes to questions about just acquisition, the idea of sort of labor mixing has just always struck me as being completely absurd as a basis for that. I just don't know why that would even matter, to be honest. And I mean, there are the sort of classic objections, aren't there? Like, okay, well, what exactly counts as mixing? Like what counts as mixing your labor? I mean, is sort of just marking out a field going to be enough, or do you have to like work the field? Do you have to, like, where do you draw the line on this? And how far above and below the field does your property extend, right? I mean, if you really start to explore this, you end up with a whole bunch of those sorts of problems. And I think more importantly, though, the big problem that I have with those theories is that any principle of transfer of property is almost certainly going to be inapplicable in our world. I mean, what you get on these theories is a kind of historical conception of sort of justice in holdings, right? Where the question of whether or not I legitimately own some object or some piece of land is going to be dependent on what happened historically with that object or piece of land. Like, was that transferred in accordance with the principles of just transfer? I think that given the amount of stealing, war, pillage, fraud, it's just going to be totally impossible to establish who owns what on this sort of view. So it seems inapplicable. So for all sorts of reasons, I find this to be a very, very unattractive position. Okay, what are your thoughts on epistocracy, particularly Jason Brennan's arguments against democracy and his defense of epistocracy? I mean, basically here, I find it. I think it's just too open to abuse. I would worry about that. I think actually my inclination is towards compulsory voting. I'm deeply troubled by the way in which governments seem to go out of their way to essentially sort of discourage voting, or I mean, not even discourage it, but make it increasingly inaccessible. I think that sort of there are some of the techniques that are used in order to make voting inaccessible to people is, it's quite disturbing to me. So I actually kind of almost want to go in the opposite direction. I mean, I'm not sure about that, to be clear. I'm not saying this is my position, but I can really see the attraction of just making it compulsory. And I mean, the point there is not really that like any particular individual has an obligation to vote. It's that by making it compulsory, you would prevent this kind of abuse from the part of the government. It would prevent them from disenfranchising people. So yeah. Anyway, I think that epistocracy is. I just fundamentally don't trust whoever it is that's in charge to be the one deciding who counts as an expert. And ultimately, it would be whoever it is that's in charge who is the one who. They would be the one decide. They would be the ones deciding, right? I just don't trust that. So I think it's too open to abuse. I mean, also, you got to bear in mind that, like, if I accepted these sorts of arguments, I would be arguing in favor of removing myself from consideration. I'd be arguing in favor of disenfranchising myself, because I almost certainly do not have the relevant expertise, and why would I do that? I think that another issue here, actually, and this is probably the biggest problem. Um, even if you could find a way of making this work and making sure that it wouldn't be abused, the problem is that the policies that you favour are not just a matter of empirical belief. They're also a matter of your values, right? So let's say, for instance, that you are a Nozikian right-wing libertarian. Well, if you go for the Nozikian view, then you're going to be in favour of reducing taxation regardless of its economic or cultural impacts. You could be an expert in economics or whatever. The economic expertise just wouldn't even be relevant to the Nozikian libertarian. The Nozikian libertarian approaches this from a sort of more deontological point of view, right? Where even if we could increase taxes in a way which would promote flourishing and well-being and all of that for the general population, we still ought not to do it because it is just wrong. It's just wrong to take people's property. As Nozick sees it, taxation is morally equivalent to a kind of slavery. That's gonna mean that the expertise that's relevant to you, it is going to be very, very different from the sort of expertise that would be relevant to somebody coming at this from a more utilitarian point of view, say. So I think the thing is that I would have no particular reason to trust that the class of experts would vote in my interests, because I would have no particular reason to trust, even if I could trust that the experts are in fact reliable with respect to their empirical claims. Right? What reason would I have to think that they share the same values as me? In fact, I think that I would, prima facie, I would have pretty good reason to expect that they wouldn't share my values, insofar as they are going to be just a sort of fundamentally different group of people from me. Most people tend to be self-interested. They tend to vote in their own self-interests. And so, insofar as these experts are quite different from me, and they're not sort of part of the same community, the same group, I wouldn't have any reason to expect them to vote in my interests. But again, even if we were part of the same group in some relevant sense, why assume that we would have the same values? My values, are idiosyncratic in some ways. So I think there's a lot of reasons why I'm not attracted to the epistocracy thing. Okay. Do you think it should be accepted? Oh man, this is like a whole paragraph here, but I'll just read it out anyway. Do you think it should be acceptable for people to make religious arguments when deliberating on matters of public policy? For example, suppose somebody says that they are against euthanasia because we have a God-given duty to preserve human life. They vote against euthanasia based on that belief and encourage others to do the same. Should that be acceptable as part of our public discourse? Or should we demand that people only present secular arguments, or arguments that are not intricately entangled with one particular view of the world, whether that be a religious or non-religious worldview? Does your answer change depending on who the speaker is? Would it be okay for an ordinary voter to make those types of arguments, but not okay for the president or prime minister to veto or advocate for public policy based on those types of parochial beliefs? So first of all, I would say that it's just not possible to make an argument that doesn't presuppose a particular worldview. Especially when it comes to politics, right? You're going to be presupposing some sort of moral framework. You're almost certainly going to be presupposing a whole bunch of empirical claims about how the world works. And I don't really get on board with the idea that there's there's some sort of neutral perspective here. I think that, look, ultimately, I disagree with religion, right? I don't want it. I think it should be resisted. So I suppose in that respect, I would say, yeah, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable in the sense that I disagree with it, and I really would prefer religions to have less of an influence. But first of all, in saying that, I'm expressing certain views from a particular point of view. I have a particular view of the world. When we decide to make a commitment to, sort of, let's say you say, okay, I'm going to make a commitment to reason and science and evidence and all of this. I mean, that's still a worldview, right? It's not like you just have like no beliefs or something. There's a worldview there, and of course, we can argue for it, and people should do, but it's still a worldview. So I think that it's a mistake to think that arguments which are presented from a secular point of view are arguments which are just not assuming any particular worldview. But anyway, yeah, so with that said, I disagree with religion, but I wouldn't say that it's fundamentally different to a whole host of other views with which I disagree. Most people are wrong about most things. And I mean, I'm certainly wrong about a lot of things too, but I just mean, there are a lot of views out there which I think are simply false and sometimes even dangerous in certain ways. It doesn't seem to me fundamentally different. Let's take, for instance, somebody who's an atheist, but who's also a fascist, because they've been convinced by arguments in favor of like super authoritarian government. Maybe they've been reading Thomas Hobbes or something, and they've also been convinced of very racist empirical claims. I mean, I don't know. Is that like? I mean, I disagree with them very strongly, and is that fundamentally different from somebody who's endorsing abortion bans on the basis of their commitment to Christianity? I don't really see why. So, okay. Do I think it's acceptable for people to make these arguments? Well, I mean, I may not like those arguments, but I suppose it's just as acceptable as making an argument from other points of view that I strongly disagree with, and it may be more acceptable. I mean, I would definitely rather have the Christian who is against abortion, average, broadly speaking, sort of liberal-minded Christian who happens to be against abortion. I'd rather have that than a bunch of like authoritarian, racist fascists. So, yeah. Inyenzi asks, why do you always use Verity as the placeholder name in your examples? Well, Verity is a really nice name for this because it comes from Latin and it means truth. And so, when we're philosophers are supposed to care about the truth, right? Truth is one of the things that matters to us. So Verity seems like a nice name. But more importantly, the real reason why I use Verity is it comes from Verity Lambert, who was the first female producer at the BBC. And she was the producer who worked on Doctor Who from the, she sort of started it. She was the mother of Doctor Who. So she was there in the first years. I also use the name Sydney. Sydney comes from Sidney Newman, who was also working on BBC. He was like the father of Doctor Who. So Verity and Sydney, that's where it comes from. Verity Lambert and Sidney Newman. I also sometimes use the names Delia and Ron. Delia comes from Delia Derbyshire and Ron comes from Ron Grainer. Delia Derbyshire and Ron Grainer worked for the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, and they were responsible for creating the Doctor Who theme tune, and they did soundtracks, some of the music in Doctor Who as well. And actually, Delia Derbyshire, brilliant electronic musician. She did some absolutely outstanding work. There's a lot of people who were involved in the BBC Radiophonic Workshop who were really quite pioneering in terms of electronic music. I mean, some of the stuff that you heard the BBC Radiophonic Workshop doing in the 1960s is just so avant-garde, so experimental. It's just, you don't hear anything like it in mainstream television these days. It's a real shame when you look at like just how wild and creative people were being back then, and with such sort of, it was all like low budget and janky, but there was this real kind of spirit of like just adventure and just trying things out. But Delia Derbyshire is one of my favourite musicians. She, not just for the stuff with Doctor Who and BBC and everything, but she was part of a band called White Noise. They did an album called An Electric Storm. Just a brilliant piece of experimental electronic music. She also did a really fantastic series of, there were sort of radio plays, but it was, I mean, it's basically like dark ambient before dark ambient was a thing. It was with Barry Beaumonge. It was called Dreams. If you're into dark ambient, look up Delia Derbyshire, Barry Beaumonge, Dreams. I particularly like the one C. It's really eerie, creepy, really gets under your skin. The atmosphere of that is just unlike anything I've ever heard. It's so, it's as good as dark ambient ever gets, and it was before dark ambient was even a thing. It's brilliant, brilliant stuff. So these people, they're all sort of heroes of mine in a way. I mean, or at least they're all kind of associated with my favourite show, the old Doctor Who's, and that's where those names come from. Okay, Jess McKinstry says, I have leanings towards compositional nihilism, but struggle with the commitment to smalls/fundamentals as it doesn't seem likely. However, I'm not sure it would really create a problem, even if there were an infinite regression of scale. Is it coherent to hold compositional nihilism and modify smalls arranged table-wise, and modify the smalls arranged table-wise statement to something like smaller and smaller arranged table-wise, or have I just lost coherence? Well, I mean, according to nihilism, there are no composite objects, right? So if you think there are no composite objects, and you think that there is no fundamental level, if you think that, for any object you take, you can always break it apart into smaller bits, then it looks like you're committed to the view that there are just no objects. So when you say that there are, smaller and smaller arranged table-wise, I mean, the key thing to notice is, no, there aren't. Not according to the compositional nihilist. For the same reason that, when the nihilist says that there are particles arranged table-wise, notice that it really wouldn't make any sense at all for the nihilist to say that there are molecules arranged table-wise. So the nihilist sees it, there are no molecules, because a molecule would be a composite object. The nihilist, I mean, at least if you want to say that there are any objects at all, it looks like you have to say that, yeah, there's a fundamental level. And what you would not be able to do on this kind of view is you wouldn't be able to get away with the kind of paraphrase that you've just said. When you say, well, there are smaller and smaller things arranged table-wise, well, no, because any one of those, when you say, there are these smaller things, no, there aren't. Because they break apart. So the compositional nihilist would say they're not real, they don't exist. Now, I do think, though, that this kind of position is maybe more plausible than it might initially sound, because I think you could quite reasonably say, look, okay, there just are no objects, and our talk of objects is just a kind of approximation. It's for whatever reason to do with the structure of the human mind or something like that. It's just useful for us to conceptualize things in this way. It's useful for us to sort of conceptualize things as living in a world of all of these objects. But that's not strictly speaking true. Actually, there just are none. I think that's fine, right? I mean, and there are sort of serious metaphysical positions that just straight up deny the existence of objects. I mean, ontic structural realists will deny the existence of objects. So I don't think that this is necessarily an absurd position, but I do think that, if we're going to be honest about this, right, if we're going to be honest compositional nihilists, you're not going to be able to get away with objects, talking about objects or talking about things arranged in some, things arranged table-wise, if you think there's no fundamental level. At least that's what I think. Okay, so Juan Diego Naranjo I don't know, am I pronouncing that right? I'm not sure. Is the effectiveness of mathematics unreasonable? If not, what's the reason for its effectiveness? Um, I mean, I think that broadly speaking, I suppose the way I look at this is I suspect that a lot of the application of mathematics is just going to come down to how it's a very, very useful tool for sort of simplification and abstraction. So, you know, if we think about like various things in the world, I mean, take for instance temperature, right? Um, we can't really talk about states of temperature, you know, in their full complexity, right? I mean, when it comes to sort of different states of temperature, we have, you know, what are we talking about? Like, you know, millions and millions of particles, and then, you know, we got to take the average kinetic energy of all of those particles and so on. This is extraordinarily complex, right? So, you know, we simplify, and one way in which we can simplify is, you know, we can notice that there's something about the structure of different temperature states that is similar in certain ways to the structure of the number line, right? So we assign numbers to temperature states. And, you know, that's a very simple case of a sort of application of mathematics. But I think that, you know, a lot of the applications of mathematics can be kind of framed in that sort of term, that ultimately we are, you know, there's certain structural similarities between empirical things in the world and between the empirical things in the world and then these, you know, mathematical models, and so because we sort of understand, you know, mathematical models are like extraordinarily simple. You know, I mean, I mean, obviously it may, well, maybe simple is the wrong word, but they're sort of precise, right? Things are precisely defined. And they're certainly, you know, I mean, they're more simple than the states in the world that we're modeling. So, yeah, I do think that it's, in a lot of cases, just going to come down to that, that, you know, we have these sort of structural similarities, and so that's why the mathematics is usefully applicable, maybe. I mean, the complete answer here is going to be much more complex, but I don't know. I feel like that's probably something of a sketch of how that works. I don't know. I'm not really sure. I don't like the answer I just gave there, to be honest, but that's what we're gonna go with. Okay. Majesty of Reason. Do you accept Gillian Russell's logical nihilism? Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure that Russell isn't actually a logical nihilist. I mean, she talks about logical nihilism, but if you know, I might be recalling this incorrectly. I don't think she actually endorses it. I think that the idea is something like, her idea is something like, if you take say the law of excluded middle, so P or not P, and then we have somebody presenting a counterexample to it. So I don't know, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Like, let's say we think that this is, I don't know, for one reason or another, let's say we think this is some exception to the law of excluded middle. So what Russell says we have to do is seek out the assumption that fails in the case of the counterexample, and then we kind of build that in to our statement of the law of the excluded middle. So basically, the assumption. So when we have a counterexample to the law of excluded middle, the assumption that's causing the problem is going to be something like, all propositions are either true or false. So that assumption fails in the case of the counterexample, because we have an example of a proposition that is just neither true nor false. So then what we can do is we state the law of excluded middle as, for any proposition P which is either true or false, P or not P. Right? So instead of the law being P or not P, we say, for any proposition P which is either true or false, P or not P. Right? And then you save the law of the excluded middle. I mean, I do worry that kind of approach is going to end up looking quite trivial. I mean, so that example of the law of excluded middle, that's kind of trivial, isn't it? I mean, it sort of feels, when you say something like, for any proposition P which is either true or false, P or not P, that does feel close to saying, you know, for any proposition P which is, for any proposition P for which it is true that P or not P P or not P. But then, I mean, look, there is a distinction between, bivalence and the law of the excluded middle, right? I mean, they're different things, so it's not completely trivial. But anyway, I think that. Anyway, that's just a brief way of saying that I don't think Gillian Russell herself is a logical nihilist. But you weren't actually asking about Russell; you're asking about me. Am I a logical nihilist? So I think that the way that I tend to look at logic, I'm a sort of instrumentalist about this. So okay, one thing that we can do with logical systems is take them as sort of idealized models of inference, and then we use that to evaluate arguments. But in my view, I don't think that there is, one true logic. I can, so certainly, like, I can decide to just classify all propositions as either true or false, and if I decide to do that, then yeah, maybe I might then decide to evaluate arguments using classical logic, and the law of excluded middle is going to hold and all of this. Or I can choose to draw finer distinctions. I can take it that there are some propositions that are neither true nor false. I don't think that there's any mind-independent fact to the matter about whether there are propositions that are really neither true nor false. And so more broadly, I don't think there's really any fact to the matter about like what follows from what. I find it kind of weird from the point of view I take to talk about like accepting or rejecting logical laws at all. I mean, I suppose in a way maybe I am a kind of logical nihilist, in the sense that I suppose I don't get on board with the idea that there are any sort of universal principles of reasoning. But then I don't know, neither does the logical pluralist. Maybe I'm a logical pluralist. I see logics as being just sort of tools that help us to evaluate arguments. Whether a tool is appropriate in some given domain is going to be dependent on our interests and our goals. And that's sort of all there is to it to me. So I don't know. I feel like I'm probably more on the logical pluralist side rather than the nihilist side. Okay, so Medcos asks, why reliabilism sucks? Why reliabilism sucks? So, does reliabilism suck? I suppose is the first question. I mean, because reliabilism is perfectly fine in some contexts as one account of what knowledge is, as an account of one way in which we talk about knowledge. I think that if we're talking about, I don't know, dogs or babies or something, and it seems like there are situations where we might reasonably talk about knowledge, the knowledge that a dog has. I might say that the dog knows that the squirrel has run up the tree. So I can attribute knowledge to dogs. I can attribute knowledge to babies. Reliabilism maybe seems plausible in that sort of situation. It seems like a fine account of what it means to attribute knowledge to dogs or babies. I mean, certainly it doesn't look like it's really going to make sense to talk about, I don't know, a dog having like a justified true belief where the justification involves some set of propositions that entails the belief or anything like that, right? But I mean, first of all, I would say that reliabilism seems to me kind of odd in the context of something like philosophy, where the whole point is like we give reasons for and against our beliefs. I mean, that's just what we're doing here, So when it comes to, and not just philosophy, but like inquiry in general, right? When it comes to human inquiry in general, I do feel like, the sort of knowledge that's generated by human inquiry, reliabilism just gets off on the wrong foot, right? It goes down the wrong path from the start. It's just not the right way to think about it. I also would say that I don't think reliabilism really does anything to address any skeptical challenge, and I mean that's sort of what I tend to be most interested in, because of course if I doubt that my capacities are reliable, then reliabilism isn't going to help me remove that doubt. So I mean there are limits to it, but again, we don't have to present reliabilism as, it doesn't have to be a theory that's even attempting to account for those sorts of things, right? I do think there are problems with reliabilism, though. To me, the most serious problem with reliabilism is probably the issue of, how exactly do we demarcate different processes? Like, what exactly? So, for any given belief, what exactly is the process that has produced this belief? So, if I take, for instance, my belief that I have hands, right? Okay, here is a hand. I have a hand. I believe that I have a hand. Well, what is it that produced that belief? Was it visual perception? Was it visual perception under normal circumstances? Was it visual perception at a specific place at a specific time? Right? Notice that if you give a different answer to this, then you're going to make a different assessment of how reliable the process is. So if you say that, if I say, well, the belief that I have hands is just produced by visual perception, well, there's loads of situations in which visual perception actually isn't reliable, in which visual perception ends up being deeply misleading. So, maybe you say, okay, well, it's visual perception under normal conditions, right? Or maybe you make it even more. If you make it specific enough, then for each belief has its own bespoke process, right? And it just, I guess, wouldn't make any sense to talk about the reliability of the process one way or the other, right? For every belief, the process is either going to be 100% reliable, it produces one true belief, or 100% unreliable and it produces one false belief. So I think that that's a problem. How we, what actually counts as the process that produces these beliefs. Notice as well, with the case of something like I have hands, I talked about the different ways in which we can kind of draw the line around visual perception, but really the situation is worse, because the belief is a product not just of visual perception, but the belief is also going to be a product of my broader community, my education, my learning, my interactions with other people, and my other senses as well. I think that really nailing down what these processes are is a very tricky matter, and so that's going to be a problem for reliabilism in whatever context you present it. Even if you're presenting it as a theory of knowledge attribution to dogs and babies, say, you're still going to face this problem. And I think it's a serious one. So maybe that's why reliabilism sucks. Onion. If you could have the entire work of a philosopher removed from the history of philosophy, who would that philosopher be? Well, my initial reaction to this is I should choose a philosopher whose work I enjoy, so that I can then copy it. I can plagiarize it and nobody will know that I've done that, and then I'll get all the credit and I'll become really famous in the field of philosophy. Of course, I'm assuming here that when I delete them from the history of philosophy, I still remember their work. So I don't know, maybe I should just delete David Hume or something, and then I can invent the problem of induction. That would be pretty cool. No, okay, so assuming I just put aside that sort of self-interested way of looking at it, I don't really know. Look, I guess my inclination might be maybe Wittgenstein. I really don't like Wittgenstein. I think his work sucks. I think he ended up becoming a sort of cult-like figure. I don't like the influence that he had. There's a certain... Well, even that's not quite fair, because there are many people who are responding to Wittgenstein who produced excellent work. I really like Kripkenstein. I like Kripke's Wittgenstein. I love that stuff on meaning skepticism. So I don't know, though. There are a sort of group of kind of Wittgensteinians who I really think have had a bad influence. I don't know. To me, Wittgenstein is like the Jordan Peterson of analytic philosophy. A lot of what he says is just incoherent, and he kind of has this cult-like status. He doesn't seem like a very nice person. I do think he should be basically removed from the sort of standard philosophical canon. There's no reason to be teaching him to undergraduates or whatever. We should choose better figures to be teaching. But I don't know really. Part of the problem here, I suppose, is that we're dealing with an extremely complex counterfactual. If you remove, so in order to give a sensible answer to this question, presumably we want to choose a philosopher who's had like some sort of influence, right? I mean, you don't want to choose some philosopher who nobody knows anything about. But as soon as you remove a philosopher who's had a significant amount of influence, you are probably going to make some pretty radical changes. I do think that philosophy seems that the trajectory of philosophy seems to me to be highly contingent. So we have this. Like, I think when it comes to something like science, many people think that science would have gone in pretty much the same direction that it went in. Even if you sort of chop out important figures, right? So you could remove Darwin, but sooner or later somebody else is going to stumble on basically the same idea, and the evidence is going to accumulate in, broadly speaking, the same sort of ways. And of course, in the case of Darwin, other people did stumble on the same idea. So yeah. I mean, you could sort of remove the big figures in science, and I mean, this is the standard view. At least the standard view is that science, the trajectory of science is not like highly contingent, right? It would pretty much go in the same direction, right? Even if you removed certain figures, made certain changes. But I don't think that's the case for philosophy. Philosophy seems the sort of like what ends up becoming popular, the fads and fashions. I think making small changes would have a big impact. So it's very hard to say. I mean, even when it's philosophers that I dislike, it can be very fun responding to them. I mean, I strongly disagree with G.E. Moore, for instance, but I've found it really interesting to explore the sort of Morean arguments and to explore the responses to them. So I really don't know. I don't know. I'm still leaning towards Wittgenstein, to be honest. Rebecca asks, what is the worst song ever produced, and why isn't it Crocodile Rock? Well, presumably part of the answer to that has to be that Crocodile Rock is a pretty good song. I mean, Crocodile Rock is, it's catchy, it's silly, it's fun. There is nothing wrong with Crocodile Rock. I quite like that one. But the worst song ever produced, I would say, I'd probably go with All Summer Long by Kid Rock. So what makes that song particularly repugnant to me is, it's based on these two earlier songs. It draws on Werewolves of London by Warren Zevon and Sweet Home Alabama by Lynyrd Skynyrd. And so Werewolves of London is one of my favourite songs. I love it. I mean, so first of all, just in terms of the music, right? It's it's just great. Like if you just want a kind of catchy pop rock song, you can't do better than Werewolves of London. But I particularly just love the story that it tells. It's such a just the imagery is so sort of unusual, and it's kind of got this sort of mischievous streak, right? Where it's about werewolves in London, obviously, and I just love the descriptions of. I mean, the opening line, right? I saw a werewolf with a Chinese menu in his hand, walking down the streets of Soho in the rain. It's just brilliant. But what I particularly love about it is that the guy describing the werewolves keeps getting distracted by how dapper they look. So he's like, you better stay away from him. He'll rip your lungs out, Jim. I'd like to meet his tailor. It's just great. So it's great because I love the descriptions of the werewolves, but then I love the way that I love the character of the narrator of the song as well. Brilliant song, and just a lovely, inventive, creative song. So I love that one. And so Kid Rock took Werewolves of London, one of my favourite songs, and then he kind of mashed it together with Sweet Home Alabama. Now, Sweet Home Alabama is a song which was created when Neil Young noticed that Alabama was full of a bunch of fucking racist shitheads. The governor of Alabama at the time, a guy called George Wallace, was just a total racist piece of shit. And so he wrote a song where he called them out. And Lynyrd Skynyrd got really, butthurt about this, and they made Sweet Home Alabama in response. So Sweet Home Alabama is, these guys getting butthurt because their state was called out for being a bunch of shithead racist twats, which they were. And so I don't really look. I like Sweet Home Alabama as a song. I mean, it's fine. It's not that I dislike it, right? But I do, right? It's like it's a good song, but it's racist, right? It's a shitty racist song. It just also happens to be, well put together musically, but it's a shitty racist song. So first of all, right, taking Werewolves of London, this lovely, mischievous, silly, fun thing that's just it's just nice, right? It's just this nice thing that's there for everybody, and then mashing it together with this like scum fucking racist shit is that's disgusting, right? So fuck that, okay? But then, okay, so first of all, he does that, right? But then, I mean, here's like, you listen to Werewolves of London, and there's this great story being told. You listen to Sweet Home Alabama, and it's got some sort of message. They're saying something. I mean, I don't particularly like what they're saying, but they're saying something, right? And then what does Kid Rock do with this? Well, he tells a story about some, generic douchebag who goes to parties and, remembers his time getting high and banging hot chicks. I mean, that's basically what that song is about. So I mean, okay, let's compare, right? Let's take what is this? So this is all summer long. This is what Kid Rock has to say. Well, we didn't have no internet, but man, I never will forget the way the moonlight shined upon her hair. Wow, never heard that one before. I bet when he woke up in the morning, the sunlight was glinting off his chiseled features, right? So yeah. Anyway, so this is Kid Rock. Now, here's Warren Zevon on the other hand. I saw a werewolf drinking a pina colada at Trader Vic's, and his hair was perfect. I mean, anyway, the point is, right, that song is just wonderful and creative, and then Kid Rock like mashed it with this racist shit, and then but then like somehow it wasn't. You know what? If he'd like, if it was just that, if it was just Werewolves of London mashed with some racist shit, it would be kind of disgusting, but at least sort of disgusting in an interesting way. But what he did, he then told a story which drained everything interesting out of it. Now it's just become like a hook. It's just become a melody, and it's this kind of background music for his generic douchebaggery. So that's what I think is probably my least favourite song. Yeah, that song sucks. I particularly hate it because if I'm like driving in the car or something and it comes on the radio, then you think, oh, it's Werewolves of London, and then you end up hearing that shit. So yeah, that's my answer to that one. Okay, Shah asks, do you agree with semantic externalism, or do you adopt a different theory of meaning? Well, I wouldn't exactly say that I'm a semantic externalist, at least not in any traditional sense. I mean, basically, the line that I take on this is that meaning is indeterminate. I'm, I guess, kind of Aquinian when it comes to meaning. So I see meaning as being a matter of interpretation, and the interpretation that you give of a person's statements can take into account almost anything. I mean, you might end up appealing to various features of a person's environment, or what you take the features of the environment to be when you give an interpretation of their statements, right? So, I mean, okay, I don't find some of the traditional arguments for semantic externalism very compelling. I don't think the twin earth argument is compelling, but I also don't see why there's any error or mistake, let's say, in saying that, let's say Verity is on Earth and Sydney is on Twin Earth. So in saying that, okay, well, when Verity says water, she means H2O, and when Sydney says water, he means XYZ. That seems fine. I mean, the people who provide that interpretation are aware of the fact that Verity does not have the concept of H2O in her head I mean, it may well be that we're dealing with a society which has just not even encountered modern chemistry, right? So we all know, we all agree, right, that Verity is not going to be able to elaborate on what H2O is. She's never even encountered that sequence of letters before, right? So we all agree with that, but it's just that when we give an interpretation of Verity's meaning, we are taking into account our beliefs about what Verity's environment is like, and we're sort of tying her use of her word water to her environment, and we're doing the same thing with Sydney. So again, where's what's the mistake? Where's the error in doing that? I'm just not sure. I'm not really sure where the error is here. And certainly it seems like there are going to be contexts where it might well be useful when we are interpreting other people to take into account features of what we believe their environment to be like. I mean, look, when we we have multiple ways of interpreting something that somebody says. There are going to be useful interpretations and confusing interpretations. There are going to be conventional interpretations and unconventional interpretations. But I don't think that there's any sort of single correct interpretation of what the meaning is. As I said, I think it's indeterminate. So there's going to be very sort of plausible interpretations which will be externalist, and plausible ones which will be internalist, and that's it. I mean, importantly, I would say that I don't think that in general there's any reason to expect that the sort of interpretation that's favoured by the speaker themselves would be privileged. I mean, I suppose this is this is one thing that we might say is, well, obviously, if Verity is living in a society which has never even encountered the idea of H2O, then of course, if you ask Verity, well, what do you mean when you say the word water? She's going to presumably talk about colourless, odourless liquid that quenches thirst, that falls from the sky, and so on. She's not going to talk about H2O, right? So Verity's own interpretation of what she's saying is not going to appeal to H2O. But okay, I mean, that's only going to matter if we think that there's some reason to favour Verity's interpretation, and I don't see why there is. And in any case, notice, of course, that any interpretation that we give of another person's meaning is itself going to be open to interpretation. So when I say that Verity's use of the word water means H2O, well, that statement, Verity's use of the word water means H2O, that's not going to have that doesn't have a determinate meaning either. So it's not just that there's competing interpretations of Verity, there's going to be competing interpretations of each of those interpretations, and so on, in an endless regress. So yes, it's indeterminacy all the way down, and so for that reason, I suppose I don't really know if I get on board with either internalism or externalism as those views are normally elaborated. But I mean, insofar as externalism is the sort of view that a speaker's meaning is going to depend on features of their environment, then well, sure, there's lots of contexts where I might give an interpretation of somebody and appeal to features of their environment, and I don't see I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong or incorrect about those interpretations. So I think that answers that question. What are your thoughts on radical social constructivism about science? Does it put the truth of facts about physics and biology on par with other forms of knowledge, like religion and personal intuition? So, I mean, this is obviously going to depend on the details of the constructivist account in question. I don't think that this sort of equalizing of science and other traditions is going to follow from constructivism just in itself. I mean, certainly social constructivism is compatible with that. But then so is realism objectivism, right? I mean, you could be a philosophical, so in terms of your philosophical account of science, you might be a realist, but then you might also think that science just happens to be on par with certain other traditions. You might be a sort of realist objectivist who is also a creationist, say. Actually, most creationists are, right? Most creationists are not social constructivists, right? But anyway, so the point is that, sure, social constructivism is probably compatible with that, but I don't think it commits you to that. So I mean, one reason for this is just okay. Let's say we're social constructivists. So we're going to say that okay, scientific knowledge is a product of these of some sort of social process, right? Social negotiation. There's some that there's something that happens when people interact with each other. And this is what produces this is what constructs, right, scientific knowledge. Whatever that process is, there's not going to be any guarantee that these other traditions enact that process. So similarly, I mean, I think pretty much everybody would get on board with the idea that money is a social construction. Money is created by us. I mean, of course, it's created by us, right? But crucially, it's not as though a single individual can just sort of stipulate by an act of their will that that they have like something that counts as money. Or maybe you can say that it counts as money, but what you're not going to be able to do is you're not going to be able to just sort of, I don't know, by a pure act of your will, like bring into existence a whole economic system. I can't just say, right, this chocolate bar, right, this just is 5p, right, and that's that. I mean, or I can say that, but nobody's gonna take me seriously, right? There is a sort of, there's some sort of prior system that has been constructed here, and where actually the chocolate bar is going to be, I don't know, 95p a pound or something. So money is a product of social construction, but it's not just like infinitely malleable. And I think we can sort of clearly see that you could have sort of alternative forms of currency which just aren't on, they don't have the same status as like the British pound. There's something special about the British pound in a variety of different senses, in a variety of different ways. There's something special about this particular kind of currency. So again, both of them are products of both of them are socially constructed, right? Like if I come up with my own form of currency, that's a social construction, and the British pound is also a social construction. But are we going to say that like they're on par? I mean, I suppose it depends on how you look at them. I mean, maybe you're going to say that in some sense they're metaphysically on par, but certainly they're not on par in any sense that matters to us in our everyday lives. And or in many other contexts, right? Like if you're an economist, for example, you're not going to say that the British pound and the currency that I've just invented are on par. So I don't see why there would be anything that would prevent the same sort of view with respect to knowledge. You could say that, yeah, knowledge is a social construction. It's just that there is something special about scientific traditions. They just construct knowledge much more effectively than these other traditions. So, I mean, I suppose that maybe I mean, there's a couple of sort of issues related to this that sometimes I think are sometimes worry people. So, I mean, one issue is the worry that social constructivism is going to commit us to some form of relativism, which I think it does. But relativism is not the view that all traditions are equal, right? Relativism is not the idea that everything is of equal validity. What relativism says is that whether a particular belief counts as knowledge is going to be dependent on, say, some perspective, or dependent on some, I don't know, social process, or dependent on some categorization scheme or something like that, right? So whether a belief counts as knowledge is dependent upon one's perspective, and there is no perspective independent standpoint. There's nothing that sort of tells us, there's nothing objective that tells us that this perspective is better than these other perspectives. But the thing is, relativism doesn't say that like all perspectives are equal. Indeed, if you were to say that all perspectives are equal, that would in itself be you'd be trying to make a kind of perspective independent assessment there. I mean, the whole point of relativism is you can't do that, and I think it's pretty clear that from the vast majority of perspectives that most people find plausible, it's not going to be the case that every perspective is equal, right? So I think we can even if you're a social constructivist and you get on board with all the relativism and so on, it's still going to be the case that you can, make the argument that no, right, there's something special about science, if you want to, if you want to make that argument. I think another issue with social constructivism is a worry that if you're a social constructivist, then okay, knowledge is going to be a product of certain social processes or a social negotiation, and what that ends up meaning is that the natural world, the objective world, has a very small role to play, perhaps even no role. So the content of scientific theories ends up being determined by, these sort of grubby kind of social processes. It ends up being determined by like the arguments that people make to each other. It ends up being determined by things like, our ability to engage in propaganda, and it ends up being a matter of fashion, right? Like this is the worry. So what we want to think is that the content of scientific theories is determined by the way the world is. Like the world out there, right? We test our theories against observation, and those are observations of the natural world, and that sort of fixes the content of our scientific theories. Whereas I guess the worry is that if you go in for social constructivism, then you're going to end up saying that, well, no, the world isn't really playing a particularly important role. It's just going to be like, propaganda and argument and rhetoric. And that's not something a lot of people want to get on board with. And certainly, if you do say something like that, then it does look like, in some sense, okay, maybe science is kind of equalized with religion and other traditions. I mean, basically, we'd just be saying that the scientists happened to be the most rhetorically effective. They were able to, they created the most compelling propaganda, and that's it. That's all there is to it. But again, there are many different ways that human beings can interact with each other. It's not all just a matter of sort of like propaganda, right? If you're a social constructivist, you're going to have to say that the knowledge is a product ultimately of these social processes. But again, we can distinguish different kinds of social processes, and it may not. And so, yeah, I don't think. I mean, again, I think it just depends on the details of the account, right? Okay, so maybe that answers that. I don't know. I'm going to leave the question there anyway. So I'm moving on now. Right, Star OSS asks, can modality be reframed as a model prediction? So it is possible for this crane to lift 200 kilograms equals, in my model of how cranes work, I predict that it will lift 200 kilograms in such and such conditions, such that we can get rid of it, or deflate it at least. So can modality be reframed as a model prediction such that we can get rid of it? I suspect that that's not going to accommodate all modal intuitions, and I think that in general it seems quite odd, really, to talk about a lot of our ordinary language modalizing in terms of like these sorts of models. So when I say something like, I could have become a research chemist. I mean, is that a matter of using a model? I guess if we take the word model in a very broad sense, right, then maybe it is. But I think what's going on there is more like I can tell a story about my life, and I can imagine my life up to the age of, 16, and then I imagine, taking chemistry instead. And I noticed that, if I had chosen at the age of 16 to take chemistry, this wouldn't have required, breaking the laws of physics. It wouldn't have required me to, grow 3 arms, right? I can basically imagine a kind of counterpart of myself who ends up doing the chemistry thing. And that's and so it's like, okay, well, that's possible then. That's something I could have done. It's, Kane doing chemistry is compatible with all of the sort of relevant features of Kane at the time. And of course, there are other people who were sufficiently like me. There are other human beings who went into chemistry. So I think that when I say something like, I could have become a chemist, that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm sort of telling a story about my life, to which I'm applying certain constraints. I'm sort of saying, right, don't break the laws of physics, don't radically alter the biology. And then I'm also thinking about just other people, other things that have actually happened, and putting myself in their place. And I'm not really sure that this is a matter of of creating a model. Again, unless we use the term model in a very broad sense. I mean, I do think that yeah, I mean, part of our, part of the account of modal language is probably going to appeal to these sorts of models. And I am quite sympathetic to the idea that, you know, modal properties, the sorts of modal properties described in science. Well, let's put it this way. There are no modal properties. Really, modality is a feature of our theorizing, and modality is a feature of our models, not a feature of the world. Remove the objective modal properties and sort of shunt modality into the models. I like that idea, but I don't think that's going to account for sort of all our ordinary language modalizing. Maybe it's a useful account of a lot of modal thinking and modal language in science. But then I suppose that's not surprising because, science is, in general, right, much, it's like you build on common sense, right? It's more precise, it's more mathematical. It's the sorts of stories that you can tell are subject to much stricter constraints. But I guess this is a kind of approach that I'm pretty sympathetic to. I quite like the idea that, when I say something like, I don't know, like you say, right, that crane could lift 200 kilograms, right? I quite like the idea that what's going on there is that we have a certain, instrumental, a model, right? We have a model of the crane, and this is going to sort of, given the laws, the relevant laws in the, of mechanics and so on, that model of the crane is going to specify various possible states that the crane could be in. And that's all it is, right? It's just a feature of this model rather than of the world. So I suppose it's something I'm sympathetic to. But whether, you ask me, can that work? Well, I don't know. I'm sympathetic to it, but it probably has a ton of problems, as every philosophical view does. So, okay. Sweebolo, what are your thoughts on retributive theories of justice? And if you find such theories unconvincing, what exactly are your views on justice? I'm not convinced by retributive theories of justice. I don't find it attractive, intuitively. I just don't see the appeal of it, to be honest. I suppose that the way that I tend to approach this is kind of broadly utilitarian, right? I think that if we're going to enact punishment at all, then the goal should just be to make stuff better. But the idea of, okay, so let's say, Verity commits a crime against Sydney, and so now we need to do something bad to Verity in order to, like what? I don't even know. It's just weird. It's like, what are we doing? We're assuming that there's like goodness and badness in the universe, and like if this person does bad to this person, then we need to do bad to them to like restore the balance or something. I don't know. It just seems a ridiculous way of thinking to me. I think as well is that, like, even if I can kind of, I say it seems ridiculous. It seems silly, but I can at least I can kind of go along with it, right? Like I can go along with the idea that that like goodness and badness might be out of balance, and so to restore the balance, we have to do something bad to Verity, right? Maybe I can get that idea, but I think that one big issue when it comes to sort of talk of punishment and justice is, look, we're talking about institutions here, right? We're talking about the state. We're talking about like the penal system, and so the problem with retributive justice is, even if I found this notion of retribution compelling, I don't think it's possible under normal circumstances for that to be enacted by the state. So let's say that Verity kills Sydney. Well, it seems to me that the people that have been wronged by that are Sydney and Sydney's family. Um, Now, I mean, okay, maybe there's some very, I mean, there's some sense in which the state has been wronged by that as well. Um, Maybe the state has, in some sense, like concern for its countrymen. But I mean, basically, right, it really looks to me like, okay, the people that have been wronged are going to be Sydney and the people that, and Sydney's loved ones, basically. So it should be Sydney's loved ones who exact retribution. I mean, if we're talking about retribution, if what we want is retribution, then it should be Sydney's loved ones who get to exact that. But of course, that's not how it works, right? We do not allow vigilante justice, I think, for good reasons. So it's the state that does it. And so I just don't even see that as being like, even if I were to get on board with the idea of retributivism, that just doesn't seem like a legitimate kind of retribution. Now, I do think that it's legitimate for the state to respond, but if we think about why that's legitimate, I mean, okay, so why is it legitimate for the state to respond? Well, it seems like, we don't want to live in a world in which people go around killing each other. We don't want to live in a world in which somebody gets killed just so someone else can steal their money, say. That's not the sort of world I want to live in. So we want to make sure that the government is doing something to stop that. So I suppose if you say, I mean, you might be able to say that there's some sense, like when Verity kills Sydney, there's some sense in which, Sydney has wronged the state. But the way that I would elaborate what that wrong consists in is just, okay, well, Verity has sort of acted in this way, which is how the majority of the population don't want to live in the sort of world where people act that way. And then that kind of demands a response from the state. So that's only going to, I think, get you to some sort of account of justice, punishment, where the point is consequentialist, right? It's like we're just doing whatever we can to stop this from happening in the future. So I suppose that's my take on that. Yeah, there you go. Right, Truths asks, what is the truth maker of negative existentials? What is the element of reality that makes true that there isn't a unicorn? What do you think of the world as a candidate, knowing the problems with negative states of affairs? Yeah, I mean, the world, a candidate of the world for the truth maker of there isn't a unicorn. I think that it's not clear to me that the world would do the job, because you could always suppose that there's more stuff than whatever the world is. So, like, if I quantify over everything, well, I can then consider that stuff, right? I can take everything, right, whatever that is, but then I can always like suppose that there could be more. So, I mean, the point is like it's so everything there is, whatever that is, can't actually be what makes it true that there are no unicorns, because it's possible for there to be more than everything, right? There might be more than like if I take everything, I take the world, well, we can always imagine a scenario where there's more stuff than that, where everything is even bigger. And so whatever, so when we say like the world is the truth maker, we have to bear in mind like we're using this term, we have to interpret this term de re, right? Like, because if we're talking about truth makers, we're talking about states of affairs. We're talking about the facts out there, right? So when I say that the world is the truth maker, I'm referring to some object, let's say. I don't know if the world is an object, but let's call it an object. So I'm referring to some object, and that object has, whatever properties it has. But that object taken as a whole, right? The thing is, there's nothing about that object taken as a whole that rules out the existence of unicorns, because there could always be something more than that object taken as a whole. Now, of course, in fact, there isn't anything more than that object. There isn't anything more than, the thing that we refer to when we use this term, the world. But the thing is, there could be. So that thing does not preclude the existence of unicorns. There could, in principle, be unicorns beyond the world, beyond everything, where those terms are interpreted de re as referring to, whatever that actually is. So I, yeah, I'm not sure that would work, right? I don't think that picking out that object, because it would be kind of like, I mean, essentially, it's sort of like, if I was to say that there are no unicorns, that the truth maker for that is just my room. Well, in that case, of course, we can all see that that doesn't work, because it's like, well, there's stuff outside of my room. So whatever's going on in my room does not preclude the existence of unicorns. But if you were to imagine, like, let's say God snaps his fingers and then just destroys everything outside of my room, well, do we want to say that my room then becomes a truth maker for the claim that there are no unicorns? I don't think we would, because it seems like, well, this room doesn't actually preclude the existence of unicorns, doesn't rule out the existence of unicorns. But I don't know. Maybe that's not a problem. I'm not sure. That's just a thought, right? I don't know if that's a convincing problem. It strikes me that might be a problem, but I'm going to move on now. Right. So Tudor Mărginean. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Do you agree with Lance Bush on his anti-philosophy stance? Why not? Well, it's funny that you said why not there, because that implies that you recognise that my answer will be no. So my answer, of course, is no. Well, actually, it's not really no, because there are many things that Lance Bush says which I find quite compelling. I mean, I agree with him on a lot of stuff, right? So actually, there are a lot of things that I agree with Lance Bush about, and many of those things are parts of his anti-philosophy stance. I don't know if Lance has I don't know, like a specific kind of manifesto style argument here for anti-philosophy. In fact, I'm not really sure if he even has a specific like conclusion. Right? He has a lot of objections to philosophy as it is currently practiced. That's fine. But I don't know if, I'm not sure he would even call himself anti-philosophy, now that I think about it. Because I know he has a lot of objections to like psychology as well, but I don't know, is he anti-psychology? I'm genuinely not sure. But anyway, there are certainly some criticisms that Lance has made of contemporary philosophy that I find compelling, but I would say I don't agree with him, because I think that for Lance, one of the sort of, it seems to me that one of his kind of underlying motivations, it rests on a kind of pragmatism. And I find pragmatism just kind of repugnant, to be honest. I think it would be a tragedy if that became, widely accepted in philosophy, at least the style of pragmatism that Lance seems to favour, to be honest. I mean, I don't know what to say, man. I look, right, the idea of sort of like, it just feels like you're turning philosophy into like a business or something, or that we're saying that philosophical ideas have to be assessed in terms of their practical utility. The beliefs have to pay rent. I mean, this is just awful to me. It's awful. I mean, ultimately, I like philosophy just for its own sake. I like thinking about these problems and engaging with these arguments, and engaging with these positions and all that. I just find it fun for its own sake. And even where I disagree with other philosophers, even when I think that their whole methodologies and everything are completely mistaken, all that, I just enjoy it just for its own sake. I enjoy doing it for its own sake. So actually, even if I were to share the kind of pragmatist motivations that Lance has, the fact that I enjoy doing this just for its own sake, that it brings me a great deal of pleasure, means that I probably carry, that would still count as like, okay, that's valuable to me then. That's I'm not going to object to that, am I? If we start to insist on framing everything in terms of how it helps us achieve our goals, I mean, the simple fact is that one of my kind of basic goals is just to do this stuff, to do philosophy. Even if we think that this is only valuable insofar as it helps us achieve our goals or whatever, then I'm still going to think that it's valuable. But you know, I don't know. It's hard to give specific objections here because I would have to go and look at exactly what Lance's objections to philosophy are, and you know, work out exactly which ones I disagree with. And so, I mean, I'm sorry, this is all really very vague. I don't like this answer at all, actually. Maybe I'll edit it out. No, I won't. I won't do that. I won't edit it out. But I don't like this answer. I'm sorry. And you know, I know Lance watches my videos. If he sees this, I hope that he's not going to take this as, you know, you don't need to respond to this. I probably shouldn't even, what am I even doing? This is horrible. It's all gone horribly wrong. Oh, God. I mean, most of it was good. Most of it worked, right? This has all gone wrong. What the hell am I even talking about? I don't know. Oh, man, I need to figure out a way of moving somewhere. Let's work out how do we get back on. Should I just answer a different question? Oh, God. This is... I don't know what to do now. Right, okay, well, we made it this far. So let's see. Let's stop for a second and rethink this. Yeah. So what I can say is that when it comes to anti-philosophy, I suppose that I'm on board with a lot of it, right? I don't get on board with the idea of philosophical knowledge. I don't think there's really any philosophical progress. But then to me, that's kind of not the point, right? Like I'm quite attracted to skeptical positions and skeptical arguments. And I think that the skeptical tradition, I mean, from the point of view of the skeptical tradition, the goal of all of this, the goal of philosophy is not to get at the truth, right? I mean, indeed, the point of the skeptical tradition is entirely to kind of undermine, you know, knowledge claims and to undermine our sense that we're getting at the truth. And I have to say, I think that pragmatism gets undermined as well. I don't think pragmatists have offered anything in the ballpark of a compelling response to skeptical challenges. So, you know, I, in many ways, share the sort of anti-philosophy approach, but I would want to sort of push that kind of critical attack just much, much further. And I want to sort of burn down the pragmatists as well. So, but nothing that violent, because, you know, I don't know why I even said that. That's, you know, that's very violent imagery, isn't it? No, I just want to kind of like, you know, sit in the corner and, you know, like, point and laugh at them. Not even that. That's really rude. I don't want to be rude. I just want to kind of, you know, sit in my own room and they don't even hear me, and I want to think about stuff in my head, and then I want to think through arguments and be like, oh yeah, pragmatists haven't got a good response to that one, have they? Okay, so I'm going to move on now. Have you ever been frustrated because of something you can't change about yourself, like ethnicity, looks, height? Well, I suppose that my inability to talk effectively off the top of my head, as you have just seen, is a pretty frustrating feature of my existence. So I kind of wish I could change that, except I'm not, you know, going to actually do anything to try to enact that goal. I mean, that's a wish that I have, but it's one of those wishes. It's like wishing that I was a millionaire or something. I don't actually care enough to do anything about it. So there we go. Do you have regrets with respect to your intellectual history, like not studying math? You know, sometimes I do. Yeah, I mean, with something like mathematics, I often feel like, man, I really wish I had. I mean, I don't want to say that I didn't pay attention in school, because, you know, I did maths up to GCSE. I did it up to when I was like 16. And I did pay attention. I got good grades. So, but I didn't continue it, you know. And sometimes I wish, like, yeah, I should have just kind of carried on doing that, because mathematics is just everywhere. I mean, especially since I went into philosophy of science. Believe me, trying to do philosophy of science with the very, very poor grasp of mathematics that I have that was not easy. That was you know, I kind of, you know, I got away with it, but just by the skin of my teeth. Anyway, so sometimes I will think to myself, man, I wish I'd studied this. But the thing you have to remember is, if I had spent time studying these other things, that would have been less time studying whatever it was that I actually studied. Or maybe it would have been less time just, having fun. It would have been less time watching, Doctor Who from the 1960s. And I really like watching Doctor Who from the 1960s. I wouldn't want to give up anything else in my life, right? So that's one thing. I mean, if I sort of think to myself, well, I wish I'd, studied this subject more, then the question has to be, well, what would you have given up? And I don't know. I don't know what I would be willing to trade for that. The other problem is this. I forget everything. I mean, even within philosophy, 95% of what I've learned in philosophy is just gone. And whenever I do a video, for instance, I can sit down for like a week, I can research something, and then within, literally a day, it's gone. 95% of what I learned is gone. I just don't retain information very well. And so I wonder, if I had studied maths more, would it make any difference? Would I remember it now? I mean, one thing I did a course in anthropology for 2 years. I did this like night class at a college in anthropology, and that was when I was, I don't know, it was after I finished school. I think it was like 19 or something, and so I did that, and I barely remember anything. I remember the names of some of the small scale societies that we studied. The Yanomamo, the Tiwi, I think. I remember that there was like some controversy with Napoleon Chagnon and the Yanomamo. I think he handed out weapons or something, or was accused of it. I also remember things, Daniel Everett and the Pirahar, but then this is stuff that I also encountered in the context of doing like philosophy of language later. So, yeah, but when it comes to just the stuff that I learned in anthropology, it's like, man, wait, I spent like what? How much time did I devote to that? And it's just gone. So what's the point regretting things that I didn't study? I would be in the same position now anyway. Okay. Ty asks, I really appreciate your ability to push back against extremely ingrained social norms. In particular, I'm thinking about the comments I've seen you make regarding punishment, victims, etc. Do you think this tendency towards intellectual subversiveness comes naturally to you, or is it something you developed over time? Well, I can tell you that when I was younger, I was far more controversial than I am now. I was far more subversive than I am now. Yeah, I have become so much more mild. So much more mild. Look, part of this is just I became a little bit more professional, I went from school into university. I went into a sort of more professional institution, and that had an effect on me. I started, the sorts of norms that were at play there were inculcated into me. I didn't, when I was at school, I suppose I sort of wanted to, there was part of me that wanted to be rebellious. I was never really in practice very rebellious in terms of my actions, but so maybe that my desire for rebellion ended up going into my beliefs, because I couldn't express it in my actions. I ended up holding these ridiculous beliefs. But when I went to university, I didn't really want to rebel against that. I kind of wanted to, I was like, oh, this is a project that I would like to make a commitment to. And so maybe that reduced that rebelliousness, or maybe it was just, growing up, right? Growing older, you become a little bit less rebellious. So I think that, I've always had points of view on things that are quite odd, I think. These days, my views are nowhere near as odd as they were. So I think that presumably the answer to the question is this has come naturally to me, and actually, insofar as I'm more conventional, that's something that's taken me quite a long time to learn. So yeah, I think that's the answer to that, and that is the end of the questions. At least that's the end of the questions that I am going to answer. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.